for people living under ISIS control than we are even hearing. But that doesn't mean, number one, that it's a threat to us here, half a world away. And it certainly doesn't mean that going to war is either a useful or the only option available. It was not true in 2001 that the only choice was either go to war or do nothing, and it's not the case now. So I think that has to be our starting point. Now there's a lot of history, I'm not going to try and repeat all of it. The origins of ISIS are not, as we sometimes hear from right-wing commentators and from journalists who sometimes should know better, that ISIS emerged when Obama pulled out the troops from Iraq. Wrong, wrong, wrong. ISIS emerged in response to George Bush sending the troops into Iraq. That's number one. It was called something else. It used to be called Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Then it became the Islamic State of Iraq. Then it became ISIS. Then it became ISIL. Then it became Islamic State. It's changed its name over and over again as it's changed its self-identity. The names are important. I'm not going to get into it now. They reflect a certain understanding of what this organization is. But its origins are not with the withdrawal of troops. It's with the sending in of troops. Because in the beginning, ISIS, in its earlier iteration, was one more extremist organization fighting against the US occupation of their country. There were dozens of them. What did happen was that with the rise of the civil war in Syria, which quickly morphed into now 7 separate wars that are being waged in that country. It's a horrifying reality. And all those wars are being waged to the last Syria. You know, just to name them, you have the original war of many Syrians, not all, against a tremendously repressive regime. You have a regional battle for hegemony, largely between Syria and its Iran and its allies, and Saudi Arabia and its allies. You have a sectarian war between Sunni and Shia, which also gets reflected between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but has a different frame to it. You have the war between the US and Russia over sea lanes and the importance of the Russian base on Tartus in Syria and the US base in Bahrain, where the Fifth Fleet is based. You have the war within the anti-Assad forces between the secular and the sectarian religious side. And finally, you have the most recent version of all of this. You have the new war among the Islamist forces within the broader opposition to the Assad government between ISIS and the other Islamists. So the war keeps eating up itself. It keeps getting worse and worse internally, and more Syrian lives are being destroyed in death and destruction and injury. And the situation in Yarmouk camp, which we heard about, once one of the largest Palestinian camps, the largest in Syria, one of the largest in the Middle East. It had almost 200,000 people who lived there. There are 18,000 people left in the camp. 3,500 of them are children, and there is no food getting in. Children have already died from hunger. There is almost no water getting in. There is no medical care getting in. People are desperate. The people who are left are those who could not flee, which inevitably, like in every war, means that overwhelmingly it's made up disproportionately of old people and young people. It's babies and children, mothers with their children, and old people who couldn't get away. That's the 18,000 people that are left in Yarmouk. And this is a product of decades of US policy. It doesn't mean that it's the US that's responsible for everything that happens on these internal wars. We can't be reductionist about this. It skews our analysis. But we are people who live in this country, and we have to look at and challenge what our government is doing, what it has done in the past, what it continues to do today, and what it's refusing to do tomorrow to make possible this outbreak of horrific wars that we're seeing. At the end of the day, the global war on terror of Barack Obama, just like the global war on terror of George Bush, is going to fail. Why is it going to fail? Because you can't bomb extremism out of existence. You can't bomb extremist ideas. You can bomb extremists. You might hit some of them. You're going to hit a lot of other people too. But when we hear about this is a war against extremists, no, you don't drop bombs on ideas. You drop bombs on cities. We're going to drop bombs on the extremists of ISIS. Okay, well, what's ISIS' capital? ISIS claims its capital is the city of Raqqa. It's a city of 250,000 people. It happens to be a UNESCO historical site. But there's 250,000 human beings who live there who didn't invite ISIS in to take it over. And when we start bombing, as the US already has, the post office and the governor's compound, who do we think is dying? Who do we think is being killed? So for all the Pentagon's claim that we don't do body counts, we don't need them to count. We know who is at stake, who is at risk, whose lives are threatened by this, and why isn't it going to work? We don't have a lot of time tonight to go over all the reasons why Iraq is more strategic than Syria at a given moment. Iraq still is important because of oil, even though it is no longer true that the Middle East is the most important source of US oil, even though the US itself is now exporting more oil than anybody else because of fracking. Global warming plays a role in all of this. Global warming was a huge part of the reason for the Syrian uprising to begin with. Again, this, the complications of all of this are important, but we don't have to know all of it. We don't have to know all of it to know that what our government is doing is wrong. They're getting it wrong again. They're getting it wrong on Iran, where there's a reasonably good agreement. It's not a great agreement, but it's a pretty damn good agreement. And for people in this country who tend to only think that the agreement is worth talking about to the degree that it will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, yeah, it's that. That's the easy part. The question is it going to bring stability or not to the region? It has some potential. It's better than anything else we've ever had. It raises the possibility that if it's allowed to go through, that maybe there could be a real grand bargain afterwards. But what are we facing right now? We're facing a scenario where our Congress, where the real extremists are based. Iran has its own extremists, and they're a pretty sorry bunch. But frankly, they're under control right now. They're not the ones making the decisions. They're not the ones saying, no, we're not going to do this. They may be saying we don't like it, but frankly, they don't have to like it. Nobody has to like it. They have to accept it. The problem is the extremists on our side. Because Congress today is only about 5 votes away from a commitment of enough Democrats to vote with all the Republicans that will give them a veto-proof and veto overturning majority. They may get 67 votes, which is what they need not just to defend against a veto, but to overturn a veto. And your Senator Cardin is one of them. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what's the action we need to take. Senator Cardin needs to hear from people in this room, every one of you, every day for the next 3 weeks. That's my challenge to you. Some of them can be emails, but at least one each week, damn well better be a phone call. To tell him, do not undermine what President Obama is trying to do in Iran. Because if you do, here's the key point. If you oppose this agreement, not, you can say whatever you want about, oh, I'm not against an agreement, I just want a better agreement. Well, there ain't going to be a better agreement. There's going to be this agreement or no agreement. And if you choose no agreement, you're choosing war. That's the bottom line. It's either this agreement or the threat of war. So that's number one on what we need to do, because our government is getting it wrong. Okay? So the question of the region being a mess, in chaos, it's absolutely true. One of the best things we could do would be to normalize relations with Iran, even if we don't get chummy, warm and fuzzy ties with Tehran. Maybe that'll come 2 generations from now, maybe not, but we don't need that. We just need to be able to talk to Iran. We need to be able to talk about establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone throughout the Middle East with no exceptions. So yeah, Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, either should Israel. The difference is, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, Israel does. That's not a good thing, that's a bad thing. The US should stop objecting to the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone throughout the Middle East. That would be a great start to bring some kind of stability. So that's another long-term demand that we can start thinking about. We need a lot from the US. Remember when I said earlier that it's never true that the only choice is war or nothing. War is the bad choice. War is making everything worse. But doing nothing should never be an option. We are too big and rich and powerful a country to accept isolationism as an okay position. You know, it's like saying, well, we're going to control the economy of the world, but if you get in trouble, hey, you're on your own. You know, that's basically what NAFTA did in this hemisphere. It's what the US is trying to do in the rest of the world with the TPP, the TTP. I always get these, you know, which is it's like NAFTA gone global. So that's not okay to say we should do nothing. And when people come back to you and say, well, are you saying we should just stand by and let it happen? No. The question is, number one, do no harm. The doctors have it right. The Hippocratic Oath starts with, first, do no harm. So that starts with, stop bombing. Stop killing people. Number two of do no harm is, don't send more weapons. Well, we're only sending them to the people we've vetted. Oh, really? No, I mean, you don't have to be quite as sarcastic as I am. But look at the results. Okay, you vetted them. They're pro-Western as could be. There are guys. Okay, there are guys. But because there are guys, you think they have the power to stand up to ISIS or the Al-Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda or anybody else who's stronger than them is going to take their weapons? I mean, let's be real here. Let's not be stupid about this. So we need massive amounts of humanitarian aid. The US is providing right now more humanitarian aid than any other single country. Not as much as the European Union as a whole, but more than any other single country. Well, we damn well should be. Given the size of our economy in the world, it's our obligation. But we're not doing enough. We need to do much more on the question of humanitarian aid. We need to go back to the United Nations and say, okay, there were two efforts in the UN with a special envoy sent to try and organize global negotiations to deal with the crisis in Syria. They both failed. So what do we do now? We don't just give up. We do it again until we get it right. The UN is doing some things right. The UN, among other things right now, is working with people on the ground in Syria, particularly women's organizations, that are trying to create local ceasefires. Why isn't the US talking about that as the important first step? Maybe because it's women's ideas. We don't usually do too well. And I'm afraid having a woman in the White House is not going to change that particularly. But this is what we need to be looking at. We need local ceasefires because they can be built into perhaps a regional and then eventually a national ceasefire. And if you get a ceasefire, what has to go with it? Yeah, an arms embargo. Now, how hard is that going to be? Nobody said this is going to be easy. But if we keep flooding the region with our arms, we have no basis to demand that Russia and Iran stop arming the other side in Syria, for instance. We've got no credibility and it won't work. And our side will keep on killing. You know, we hear a lot about the horrors of ISIS. We hear about the beheadings, and it is horrifying. We don't hear as often about Saudi Arabia's beheading. That's their usual punishment for people for a whole host of crimes, including what they call terrorism, which includes atheism, is now equated with terrorism. We also don't hear about the beheadings carried out by the Free Syrian Army. That's our guys. That's the ones that are vetted, right? They beheaded 6 fighters, allegedly ISIS fighters, just 1 week after the 2 American journalists were beheaded by ISIS. So this is like a game of who can behead more people on all sides. So anybody we support at this point militarily is going to use our weapons for more horrors. So in my last couple of minutes, the question of what else do we need to do? I started with one thing. The first thing we need to do is defend the agreement with Iran. The second thing we need to do is figure out how we get Congress to stop moving forward on these wars. What's up for grabs right now is a new authorization for the use of military force. There's two already in the works, two already in existence. One from 2001, passed just 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, when only one person in the entire Congress, the very heroic Barbara Lee from California, our great congresswoman that we all wish she could be our congresswoman, although Donna Edwards does a great job too, was the only one who voted against it. That one's still in operation. And the Obama administration says they're relying on that. They don't think they need a new one at all. But yeah, we'd like one because we want to send a message to the world that we speak in one voice. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we don't speak with one voice. We are not united on this question. We are not united, and we've got to stop them from passing another authorization for the use of military force. So here's the tricky part on this one. Here's the other assignment. That you've got to talk to your members of Congress, you've got to talk to your senators, talk to your local city councils and state governments, all of whom have something to say about this. But here's the trick. We need what we call at IPS both an inside and an outside strategy. So our position as people, as peace activists, as people committed to internationalism, has got to be no new authorization. Period, full stop. We also know that the chances are pretty good that there might be an authorization. So the inside side is somebody's got to be in the room with these people saying, look, if there is one, it has to have a sunset clause, meaning it can't go on forever. It has to go for 1 year or for 6 months or for 30 days, and that's all. It has to have a geographic limitation. It has to have a limitation on the kinds of weapons that can be used. It cannot be just another full-blown authorization for whatever you want to do, wherever you want to do it, for as long as you want to do it, against whomever you want to do it to. That's our job. At the end of the day, we are working in a country in crisis. The crisis of racism and the police assaults that we're seeing over and over again in cities across this country, the enormous and escalating crisis of inequality, the crisis of lack of jobs, our country is hurting. And for us as a peace movement, to be asking other movements to be part of this, we have to make our issue relevant to and part of broader and bigger movements that engage more with young people, with people of color, with the communities that are hurting more than many of our own. That's the ultimate challenge for the peace movement. How do we move from being one separate organization, one separate movement, stronger at some points, weaker at other points, to being a peace stream within a broader river? That's got to be our goal. We can't do it alone, and we can't do it separate from the demands of the other parts of the people in this country who are fighting for immigration rights, who are fighting for women's rights, who are fighting for GBLT rights, who are fighting all of the important fights that are going on today. We can't separate the fight against war, the fight against military spending. If we weren't spending these trillions on these wars, we'd have money for jobs. We'd have money for healthcare. Obamacare wouldn't be what it is today. It would be real universal health coverage. We have an enormous job to do. But the good side is we can do it together. Thank you.
We'll take a 15-minute break and then come back for question and answer discussion. Thank you very much.
How much of a break?